Alright, so yesterday we talked about Punch McLaughlin, and a couple days before that we talked about Spike O'Toole. We've been talking a lot about the conflict of the 1960s between Winter Hill and Charlestown that eventually erupted and engulfed the whole city of Boston. But today in this video, let's backtrack a little bit and let's talk about the city of Boston before this conflict. Because it's important because it definitely kind of shaped the conflict going forward, and after the 1960s the city was completely different. The underworld looked different, a lot of the landscape of Boston looked different from urban renewal, and before that, for probably since like after the Depression all the way until the 1960s, Boston really didn't change a whole lot. And that was a big reason why urban renewal was brought up, because by 1960s Boston was like a really old, dirty industrial backwater. It was poor. There was like white ghettos that there weren't a lot left in a lot of these northern industrial cities. South Boston, Charlestown, most of Dorchester, East Boston, the North End. Different white ethnic slums, and all the industries were starting to die out and go away. There wasn't a lot of jobs, a lot of unemployment. Crime was rampant, and that's why the government came through with urban renewal, and they started knocking down all these old tenements, like the entire West End neighborhood over by like where North Station is and Boston Garden. Like, that used to be all giant tenement buildings, and they knocked like a whole neighborhood down. They basically raised it to like, it was like non-existent. Like, all the buildings over there were gone, and then they built like Mass General Hospital. They built a bunch of stuff over there that none of that stuff existed. Those were all, it was all like a residential neighborhood before, and so they were trying to change the face of Boston. And like, to think about that now is pretty wild, considering it's the third, probably going on the second most expensive region area in the state to live in the country, and getting to be one of the most expensive in the whole world. But just, half a century ago or so, a little bit more, Boston was a slum. It was a dirty, gross, poor, violent place that nobody wanted to live in. And these living conditions, mixed with people that were basically born and raised during the Great Depression, a lot of these guys went to World War II at an early age and saw crazy amounts of violence. And like, when you grow up and see all this kind of stuff at an early age, extreme poverty, extreme violence, people getting killed in front of you, kind of desensitizes you. And it makes, I remember Howie Winter did an interview, and he was saying that, life was pretty cheap back then. And it probably was for a lot of these guys. They probably didn't think too much about taking someone else's life. So let's talk about some of the neighborhoods, some of the groups, like the rackets that they were involved in. So obviously the two main neighborhoods that were involved in this conflict were the neighborhood of Charlestown and the city of Somerville, primarily the Winter Hill neighborhood, Somerville. So Winter Hill is basically like, it's a neighborhood that sits in the middle of Somerville. The main thoroughfare of Broadway goes right through Somerville and goes right through Winter Hill, right through the heart of Winter Hill. And they used to hang out at the old Marshall Motors garage. That was like their headquarters. But so Winter Hill, Somerville, and Charlestown, they're right next to each other. Like, Somerville, Charlestown, Cambridge, they're all border right at one another. So before this thing popped off, all these guys knew each other. They all used to hang out with one another. They would frequent the same bars. Like, Charlestown guys would go over into Somerville to bars, vice versa. Somerville guys would go over to Charlestown bars. And that's another thing too, is like, back in these days, there were so many bars, like dive bars particularly, in the city of Boston. Like, Boston was a predominantly Irish city. There's a lot of other ethnic groups, and a lot of these other ethnic groups like to drink as well. The Greeks, the Italians, Polish, mostly Eastern Europeans love drinking their beers. There was bars everywhere in Boston. It was a huge part of the social life, the culture. A lot of these criminal organizations ran a lot of their rackets out of these bar rooms. Their sports betting, their numbers racket, which is the lottery, because back in the day the lottery was not legal. The Massachusetts state, there was no Powerball, for nationwide. There was no Massachusetts state lottery where, your grandmothers would watch every night to see the number being drawn. Like, back in the day, the mafia and different criminal organizations controlled that, and it was a huge moneymaker. And they would have like numbers listed every day in the newspaper for like, I think it was like results of a horse race from the day before, and it would be like some certain sequence of numbers that would come in on that in the newspaper a day, and that's how the numbers would be picked. So it was like impartial, and nobody was setting it up because they couldn't pick the horse. There was ways they could get around that though, and they were able to, I think, like through wire. Some guys, I'm just in my head, it just popped up. I believe that they were able to get results of like the horse races early or something. Some people, they were able to cheat through the numbers some way that way. But that's how originally it was done. Like, it's crazy to think now, like the government got wise and they basically legalized all this stuff and they're taxing it. Now you can download a sports betting app on your phone and bet like on sports games on your phone. That's must be great for guys who have like really bad gambling addictions. They must love that. Jesus, it's a crazy world. But anyway, so Charlestown, Winter Hill, like I said, these guys were right next door to each other. They were all friendly before. Not all friendly. I'm sure there was like beefs like anything else. That's another thing too, is like Boston was a tough city. Every neighborhood kind of like, all the neighborhoods were tough, but they all wanted to, like, it was competition to see who was tougher and who had the best reputation. Like Buddy McLean, he was, I guess, a storied street fighter, and it was like a Friday, Saturday night thing, like entertainment for the towns. Like, he would get liquored up in a watering hole and basically would walk up and down Broadway and see if like anybody was gonna had the stones to challenge him to a fist fight. And I guess this guy was like a just storied fighter. Like, if he was alive today, he probably would have gone into the UFC or like mixed martial arts or something, or a professional some sort of fighter, because he trained like before people. All these guys used to smoke and drink and eat all types of crappy food. They didn't know about nutrition and exercise and stuff back then. Like, nobody drank water. It's like health was like an afterthought. But this guy used to go to the Tufts, which is a college, and the campus is in Somerville. He used to go to their track and run laps with his German Shepherds. He also had 2 German Shepherds, and he was like an avid German Shepherd like enthusiast and trainer. And I guess he had these dogs trained so well that he could bring his kids. He had like 3 or 4 kids. He could bring his kids to the movies in downtown Somerville and leave them in the movie theater, and leave his German Shepherds in front of the movie theater and go across the street and get a couple drinks and go talk to his buddies. And if the kids tried to wander out, the German Shepherds would block their exit. Whether or not that's true, it's a pretty freaking awesome story. So he would do laps around the Tufts track, the professional college like field where they have track and field. He would do laps with his German Shepherds there. He'd go to the YMCA in like East Cambridge, I think, and do weight training. And he was just like, he'd fight for sport, for reputation. And that's like the culture of what Boston was like. Now, of course, you punch somebody in the face at a bar, you're gonna probably do like, if you have a record, you're gonna do like 6 months to a year in county, or get a couple years probation, or have to pay like restitution for the guy's face, or what. It's just it was like sport back then, and the whole city was like, come out and, oh, who's buddy gonna fight tonight? Who's gonna wipe down tonight? You know what I mean? Like, but now it's, you get sued and you get a probation for a couple years at the least. Much different world. And oh yeah, and in Somerville you can't buy a house for under $1 million too. So put that on there. So that's probably why people on downtown on Broadway cheering people fist fight anymore, because I don't think people that can afford to pay $1 million for a house, I don't think that's how they like to entertain themselves on a Saturday night. I'm just going out on a limb here. I don't know, what do you guys think? So also, besides Charlestown, Winter Hill, because I'm just talking about these 2 neighborhoods first, because these guys were how this thing kicked off, was because Georgie grabbed some girl who was a girlfriend to, like I said yesterday, Bill Hickey, and this guy Red Lloyd beat the crap out of him, put him in the hospital, almost killed him. They took it a little too far. And Bernie wanted retribution. He wanted to kill these guys. He wanted Buddy to serve him up, but he said, I'm not going to do that. So they tried to put a bomb underneath Buddy's car. Buddy's caught them trying to do it, tried to shoot him that night, or just basically just shot to scare him away. And then the next day he shot Bernie McLaughlin, killed him. And it just kind of spun out from there. Punchy, I think it was Punchy and maybe Georgie, or it was some combination of Charlestown guys caught up with Buddy's friend, who was this guy Russ Nicholson, and he wasn't actually metropolitan cop in Boston. Back in the day, I don't know when they disbanded. I'll have to look that up because I want to do an episode about MDC cop Joe McCain too. He was a legend from Somerville, from Winter Hill actually, and he was a cop and he ended up becoming like a private investigator after. But he was like a legend in the city of Boston. But he was an MDC cop. So back in like the 1940s, 50s, and the early 60s, I don't know when they disbanded. It might have been after the 60s. They had metropolitan police as well. So they had like Boston City Police, Mass State Police, and then they had the Metropolitan Police Department, and they used to patrol like the whole Boston metropolitan area. They had like stations on Revere Beach. Like they would always be like hemming people up by the Tide Lounge, that big mafia bar on Revere Beach. And they were kind of had jurisdiction all over the whole Boston area, and that was kind of cool. I don't even know if people even know that there used to be a law enforcement branch of Metropolitan Police in Boston. So there was also Wimpy Bennett. So we talked about his crew a lot. They were out of Roxbury, and he also controlled rackets like in big parts of the South End. And traditionally, 1960s and before, Roxbury was a mixture of it was like Jewish for a while, but then they moved more towards Mattapan. They ended up the more wealthier Jewish people moved towards like Brookline and Newton, to like the wealthier suburbs west of the city, and then a lot of the black population that was in the South End originally kind of migrated more into Roxbury and settled into Roxbury and like lower Dorchester, lower upper Dorchester. But when Wimpy was running the city, it was like running the neighborhood of Roxbury. It was like a mixture of Irish and Italian, some Eastern European, a lot of Middle Eastern, like Syrian and Lebanese, Greeks, some, like I said, black African Americans. It was kind of a real mixture. And Larry Bayonne, who ended up becoming number 2 in the Italian Mafia, grew up in the South End, and I think that he used to kind of extort a lot of people in the South End and try to just throw his weight around. And there was always like a delicate balance between Wimpy Bennett and Larry Bayonne, because Wimpy Bennett was very close with Raymond Patriarca, who was the Don. He was out of Providence. He wasn't even in Massachusetts. He was out of Rhode Island, but Raymond controlled the Italian Mafia in all of New England. So Jerry Angiulo, who was his underboss, controlled Boston, but he answered to Raymond. So technically Raymond controlled Boston, but there was a lot of stuff that went on that he didn't know about, and that's where like Wimpy Bennett came in. He had a nickname for Raymond Patriarca. He called Raymond Patriarca George. I don't know where this came from, but he would be talking about George, and it was like his code name for Raymond. And he didn't think, like, obviously people knew that he was talking about, be like, oh yeah, George, when he talked to him on the phone, or I gotta go visit George. But basically a lot of the Italian guys in Boston didn't like Wimpy, and they thought, he was Raymond's mole in Boston. He was his rat, that if they were doing stuff and they didn't want Raymond to find out about it, maybe they had some stuff going on the side, or they were making a little extra money and they didn't want to give it to Raymond, they didn't want to find out about it, and they wouldn't want Wimpy to find out, or the Roxbury guys like Steve Flemmi or Frank Salemi and stuff to get wind of it and pass it on to Wimpy, because then Wimpy would go snitch on him to Raymond. So a lot of these guys didn't like him like that, and then there was always rumors that Wimpy was too close to police, and he'd be like, oh yeah, I pay the police off and I get information from them, they tell me who's working with them and where the investigations are, and blah blah blah. But it was later revealed that he was just straight up giving information, and I believe it was when Spike O'Toole shot at him in 1965, like a month before they caught Jimmy the Bear. I think he reported it to the police, and Patriarch was like, yeah, you can't do that. And then something else happened, and then Steve Flemmi and all them, like Frank Salemi and all his underlings, they basically, Steve Flemmi and Frank Salemi, I think they just wanted to take control of the neighborhood, and they didn't want to have a boss anymore, so they kind of used it as an excuse, because both of them ended up becoming FBI informants. Like Steve Flemmi very soon after, Frank Salemi longer. More. It was a couple decades later, but Steve Flemmi became an FBI informant in the 1960s. But anyways, they snuffed out Wimpy. They took out their boss, but it was because they used that as an excuse that he gave information to the police officer. It was like Bill Stewart, detective of Boston Police, specifically, who was like his guy, and then that became like Fleming's guy after he just adopted it, and then Fleming just became a straight up FBI informant. So it's like all this stuff is all such hypocrisy. You know, they killed Wimpy for being a rat, and then Steve Fleming takes on the Bill Stewart, the detective, keeps him on his payroll and gives him information, gets information from him, and then also becomes an FBI informant, has his own personal relationship with H. Paul Rico, the special agent in charge in Boston. These guys are such hypocrites. So we talked about Charlestown. We talked a lot about that in the last couple of videos, because Spike and Punchy, like, I don't want to just move on without giving like a quick just overview of the Charlestown crew. So it's like, you got the three brothers, Bernie, Punchy, Georgie was the youngest. Then you got Cornelius, aka Connie, and Stevie Hughes. These guys are probably two of the most lethal like brothers in the whole city of Boston. Old school rough and tumble guy Harold Hannon, Earl Smith, and Spike O'Toole. And then there's this guy, Thomas Ballou, who straddled... I'm sorry, I don't mean to be jump back and forth. I just didn't really give a description of like the Charlestown crew before I moved forward. There's this guy, Thomas Ballou, and he like straddled the fence. He was more kind of with the Charlestown guys first, but he was also really good friends with Buddy McLean. But he ended up like going to prison during the war, and he stayed in there because he didn't really want to get out, because he didn't want to have to choose a sides between the two, because he was friends with both sides, and he probably didn't want to get killed either, so he figured the safest place was to be inside. But there's like a legend that surrounds him back in the days that he used to hang out at like rough bars like in the Charlestown waterfront, and he had $100 bill and a longshoreman's hook. And when I edit the video, when I'm talking about it, I'll put a picture of a longshoreman's hook. But like, I used to use those working at a place in America, but like everybody used to have these guys, because almost everybody that worked like on the waterfront were longshoremen or stevedores or lumpers, and they had stuff like this to help them move the freight around. But he would, if anybody would give him trouble, or if he felt like getting into a fight or whatever, his thing was he would pull out the $100 bill and hold it in the air, and usually the person would go and look at the $100 bill and not pay attention for a second, and he would take the hook out with his other hand and get him with the hook. So pretty vicious shit. I don't think not now anyways. I'm getting soft my old age. Maybe like when I was like a teenager in my 20s, I would have thought that drinking down in Charlestown would have been pretty funny back. Back in those days, I would have found it entertaining. I wouldn't want anything to do with that kind of scene as a 40-year-old now at this point. But it must have been pretty wild. All those type of guys that I just talked about, like all these longshoremen, stevedores, lumpers, all the Navy sailors from the Charlestown Navy Yard, all the employees from the Navy Yard, and then you got all these gangsters and hoodlums too, all just a bunch of rough and tumble guys all day drinking all day long at these bars. It must have been wild. All right, so we talked Charlestown, we talked about Winter Hill, talked about Wimpy's Roxbury crew. Wimpy's Roxbury crew that's where Steve Fleming and Frank Salemi started their notorious criminal careers in the city of Boston. And these guys would take over the Roxbury crew after they knocked off Wimpy, and they would end up getting closer to the mafia. Steve Fleming really didn't want to. He wanted nothing to do with the mafia. They really wanted him because he was 100% Italian. He was proven to be a capable killer. He was an earner. He had brains. Frank Salemi wanted real bad to be with the mafia. He was the one that was more pushing for them to make their alliance with them and to become made, but he was half Irish. So at least when Raymond was the Don, there was no chance of him becoming main, but he was like in love with Larry Bayonne. Steve Fleming even noticed, like after they were hanging out with him a lot and going to the Batcave, Peter Lamone's bar, that Frank Salemi would be, talking like Larry Bayonne and copying his mannerisms, and he was like, man, I don't really want nothing to do with these guys. And Steve Fleming at no time in his career wanted to be part of the Italian Mafia. So then another crew that was big at the beginning of the 1960s gang war and became stronger throughout was Joe Barbosa's East Boston crew. So they Joe Barbosa basically was a guy from New Bedford, a Portuguese guy. New Bedford's a big fishing city, big big Portuguese community down in New Bedford. We got a lot of Portuguese here in Gloucester too. They're just Portugal is a huge fishing country, so they go anywhere where there's a big fishing industry. So, but he migrated. This kid started going like the reformatories and stuff when he was young. Started going to prison when he was, like a teenager. He was just like a regular at the newly built Walpole maximum security prison. Always in prison, just a complete knucklehead, troublemaker. Just real tough kid though, and always just trying to make a name for himself. Nobody really took him too seriously. Then he ends up somehow becoming friendly with Henry Tomiello, who was Raymond Patriarch as underboss for a while, and then when he made Jerry underboss, he bumped Henry Tomiello to consigliere, but Henry Tomiello, his nickname was the referee, and he was, one of the most well-respected, even-keeled, smartest, sharpest guys probably in the Mafia, in the New England Mafia. And he took a shine to Joe, and that was the one thing, though, that Henry wasn't very good at, is the people he surrounded himself with, like his driver and main guy, like basically his assistant was Fat Vinny Teresa, who ended up becoming number 2. So Joe Barbosa was the first ever federal witness. They started the witness protection program because of him. So he was the first ever, and then Vinny Teresa was number 2. So poor Henry Tomiello picked for people that he brought into his fold, number 1 and number 2 in the witness protection program. That's a pretty dubious thing to be attached to your name. But anyway, so Joe basically was this guy. He was a killer. Whatever you want to say about him, rat, scumbag, like whatever. The guy was a killer. I mean, I think he ended up racking up over 26 bodies in his career. I think that's what he copped to when he made the deal with the feds, and they brought him as the star witness to perjure himself and put people away for crimes they didn't commit. It was just what a crazy time. I'm not going to talk too much about that in this video because I'm just trying to give like an outline of what the neighborhoods in Boston were like and the different crews in these neighborhoods. So, East Boston. All right, so Joe like proves himself to be a killer. He's a tough kid, always in prison. He's on the street now. He meets Tomiello. He's starting to get a little bit of a crew underneath him. He ends up setting up shop in East Boston. I forget what the name of. I should have wrote it down. It was like a bar. It was like a bar and grill in East Boston, and he basically just took over. And the owner really, what's he gonna do? You know what I mean? So he makes that his headquarters. He's got a crew. He's got these guys. He's got Tosh Bratos, which I think he's a Greek. I think that's a Greek name. So he's from the south end of Boston. This guy hates Larry Bayonne because I guess in the late 50s, Larry Bayonne killed his brother, and so that leads to like some stuff that happens at the Nightlight Cafe. But Tosh Bratos does not like the Mafia. He's mean. He's a tough guy. All these guys that were in Joe's crew were tough guys, and they were guys that didn't particularly like the Mafia. They didn't like the establishment, you know what I mean? They had kind of an edge to them. So Tosh Bratos was definitely that kind of guy, but he used to get drunk and be real nasty, and he'd always talk kind of openly about how he was going to kill Larry Bayonne for killing his brother. So he had Tosh Bratos. He had Tommy DiPricio, Patsy Fabiano, James Kearns, who was a tough Irish dude, and then Chico Amico. What was his first name? But his nickname was Chico. But that was Joe's Joseph Chico Amico, and that was Joe's like boy. Joe looked at him like he was like a little brother. He loved this guy, and when they ended up killing him, it put Joe over the edge. But and then also there was this guy named Nicky Famia. Nicky Famia would end up going on to becoming part of Whitey Bulger's crew. So like that's why I'm talking about like making this video, because after the 1960s gang war, the underworld's completely different. Like Joe's crew gone, Wimpy's crew basically gone, except for Stevie and Frankie, but they were off on different things. Charlestown crew gone. Like 90% of these crews that I'm discussing here in this video were no longer existent. These crews that were around for decades, so are not Joe's in that particular case, but the Wimpy's crew, the Winter Hill crew, Charlestown, the Mafia still existed after, but we're around for decades. But then after the war, completely gone, and a lot of like the makeup of Boston looked different too because of urban renewal. So that's like the kind of narrative. I'm gonna try not to get off on too many rants, but that's like the main theme we're gonna stick with here on this video. Is that's what I'm trying to outlay is the how Boston was a certain way before and then so different after. So East Boston was an Italian neighborhood, and it was a mafia stronghold for the most part, as was the North End and Revere. But Joe set up a little beachhead, right in the middle of East Boston. And like I said, he had that was a pretty deep roster. The guys I was just naming off. Well, Nicky Famia, who I said ended up going and being with the Bolger crew, he was he had something to do with like the Blackfriars massacre, where before the Chinatown massacre, I think it was like the largest, there was the most victims of homicide in one place at one time before the Chinatown massacre, and he was the main suspect that everybody considered he did. I think he died of a drug overdose in the 80s after Bulger kicked him out of his crew for being a fat drug addict. I think that's literally why Bulger kicked him out, because he ate McDonald's all the time and was high. He used to So, and also, Nicky Famia got beat up by Louis Greco for loaning money to the neighborhood kids in East Boston, and Louis Greco was one of the guys that Joe put in. So Joe put 4 innocent guys into the Teddy Deegan murder after him and his friends did it. He put 4 innocent guys, 2 of them went to death row, and Louis Greco was one of the guys who went to death row, and he ended up dying in prison. 2 of the guys, after it came out that Joe made the story up that none of them were involved in the murder, and the FBI knew it the whole time. 2 of the guys were released, and they sued and got a bunch of money, but Henry Tomiello died in prison and Louis Greco died in prison. And the whole reason why Joe put him in on that murder was because Louis Greco embarrassed Nicky Famia. He beat him up in public, in front of the people, in front of the kids, and Nicky Famia was like hiding underneath a car, like trying to get away from him, and Louis Greco was like, "Get out here," and trying to pull him out, and it was like Joe was like so upset that like he was like humiliated Nicky and made his crew look bad, so he put the guy into prison onto death row for that. And Joseph Salvati was even worse. Joseph the Horse Salvati, he like welched on like a $50 or $100 loan that Barbosa loaned him, and when Barbosa was trying to make bail to get out, he wouldn't pay. He was like, "No, I'm screw that guy, I ain't paying." So Barbosa put him in on the murder too. Like, Jesus, man, like that's friggin' messed up. So, like I said, East Boston was a pretty much very strong. I mean, obviously there's other people besides just Italians that lived there, but it was a very, very densely strong populated Italian neighborhood, and it was like a, J.R. Russo came from East Boston. His brother, his stepbrother, or I don't know if it's his half-brother, stepbrother, Bobby Caruso, and these guys would go on to be, even with the Renegade, they were in charge of the Renegade faction that took on Ray Jr. and Frank Slemmy, and I talked about that in my 1990s Mafia War. So I mean, East Boston was like a big time. It was number 2 to the North End for Mafia strongholds. But like I said, Joe Barbosa and his crew, they had enough juice and they were strong enough that they were able to set up a beachhead in the middle of that. So you had Charlestown was basically almost all Irish. Winter Hill, Somerville was a mixture of mostly Irish. There was Italian, various other white groups and stuff like that, ethnic groups. Roxbury, I said the makeup of that. East Boston was predominantly Italian. The North End that is Little Italy in Boston. That's I've talked about the history of the North End over and over, about how every immigrant group that first comes to Boston goes to the North End first. So I don't need to get into all that. But the North End is where Jerry Angiulu is from, and he ran his operations out of the Doghouse, which was his parents' old grocery store. And he had 5 other brothers, and basically they bought their way into the mob pre-1960s with the Kefauver hearings. Like a Senator Estes Kefauver started these national Senate hearings, and the feds all of a sudden, FBI was freaking out. There was all this, like, out of nowhere in the late 50s, all this heat from the federal government started coming towards the mafia. And the old guys, the old guard of the Italian Mafia in Boston, Joe Lombardo and Phil Buccola, they got scared and it forced them into early retirement. And Raymond ended up becoming the Don, and the power base moved from Boston to Providence. So he ruled over all New England from Providence. And the young Jerry Angiulo, who was making a shitload of money while Joe Lombardo was hiding out from the heat, he like took over a lot of the gambling operations, and he was a kid who was brilliant. He had a great mind for numbers, and him and his brother was making tons of money. But the only thing is that like Larry Bayonne, like I was talking about from the South End, was coming up in there and he was muscling in. He was shaking him down. There was nothing. His Bayonne was besides Russo and a couple other guys, Bayonne was the toughest guy in the mafia. He was the most feared hitter in the Italian Mafia in Boston. So there's nothing to Angiulo. Even like his toughest brother, I think Danny Donato Angiulo was the tough brother. But even him, he's not going to do nothing to Larry Bayonne. So Jerry Angiulo famously puts, I think it was like 50 grand, which was a shitload of money back then, into a suitcase and travels down to Atwell's Avenue to see Raymond Patriarca at the Coinomatic at his office. And he gives him a proposition. He goes, I'll give you this and 100 grand every year and to let me operate and be in Boston. That's when he made him his underboss and bumped Tomiello to Consigliere. And Tomiello used to basically kind of set up shop at the Eventide Lounge in Revere Beach, but he was always kind of bouncing around. He was all over the place. But he was kind of the back and forth guy from Boston and Providence. But Jerry Angiulo, after that, he ran Boston. He ran it from the North End. And the guy, he was just a genius. Like, he ran card games, the dice games. He would do sports betting. The dog and horse track betting were huge back then. They had Suffolk Downs was the horse track. They had Wonderland, which was the dog racing track. And these were huge moneymakers. And that was like huge cultural things too back in the day. And Jerry Angiulo used to give, like, he had this system where he would get, like, independent bookies, and he'd give people a certain percentage and to, like, run their own numbers and stuff like that. So he had, like, all these operating agents out, and he was, like, collecting percentages from them. And he just had a great mind for numbers, and he was just making a shitload of money. And once he had the blessing of Patriarca, and he was a made man, and Bayonne was his right-hand man, with the combination of, like, his brains and Bayonne's strength, like, they were unstoppable. And so, but basically, though, before the gang war in the 1960s, like pre-1960s, like everybody is kind of like off in their own section, you know? Like, Italian Mafia, yeah, they're probably the strongest entity overall. They proved that after, like, they took out the Gustin gang in the 30s, the early 30s, that nobody really fucked with them after that, and that they were the strongest. But they didn't, like, have an iron grip all over Boston. Like, they had certain people that they used to tax and collect, and they had their own bookies in certain neighborhoods in different cities around the city, around the the surrounding area, the metropolitan area. But they didn't like control every neighborhood in Boston. It's not like every single neighborhood kicked up to it. Like Charlestown would do contract killings for them, and they probably got some money from Angiulo and put it out in the street. They probably got loan sharking money and stuff like that. And like Stevie Hughes was really close with Larry Bayonne. Larry Bayonne kind of had his own little circle, you know. Like I said, he wasn't a North End guy, so like he was like number 2 to Angiulo in the city, but he had like his own little kind of like South End crew. Like, and he had this guy Red Assad, who I believe was Syrian, and he was a tough guy, and he was involved with the murder of Tosh Brathos' brother that I talked about earlier. And he also had this Jewish guy who was a friend of his, Phil Wagenheim, and he's kind of like a mysterious guy. You hear his name pop up a lot, and that he was involved in stuff, and he was involved in the bombing of John Fitzgerald, Barbossa's lawyer, who got a little bit too close to Barbossa. And when Barbossa was locked up, he was passing messages back and forth between Barbossa's crew members and stuff, and that's not normal behavior for a lawyer to do stuff like that, pass like criminal messages back and forth. So like he crossed the line from the lawyer. He'd been straddling that line for a while, and Patriarca decided, he went too far and he had to go. So Phil Wagenheim was with Larry Bayonne and Steve Salemi, and it was him and Bayonne that put the bomb. Actually, no, it was Frank Salemi and Bayonne. Never mind, I'm getting ahead of myself. He was involved in the planning of it, and then when they fled after the fact, he was with them, and he brought the weapons out to LA for Flemmy to kill Peter Poulos. I'm kind of jumping around here, but so anyways, the North End though obviously is Boston's Little Italy. That's the mafia's been the mafia stronghold, but before the Boston gang war, the 1960s, the mafia, like I said, they didn't control the whole city of Boston. All these other neighborhoods were strong enough and their crews were big enough, and they kind of were independent, you know? Like, everybody had their own rackets. Some neighborhoods, obviously, were more profitable and better organized than others. Like, the North End, obviously, made more money than, like, say, Dorchester or whatever. All these neighborhoods had a certain amount of independence, and like neighborhoods like Dorchester and Southeast, South Boston, these were kind of like backwaters compared to like the North End and Charlestown and Somerville and South Boston before the gang war, and it wasn't really involved in the gang war. They had their own little second gang war. I made a video about that between the Colleens and the Mullins, but like the Colleens basically ran Southie, and that's who Whitey Bulger joined with after he got out of prison. But Whitey Bulger wasn't even on the streets during the conflict, during the first conflict. He was in Alcatraz and other federal prisons for bank robberies they did in the 1950s. But Billy O'Sullivan, Billy O, was I don't know if he was actually from South Boston or he was from Dorchester, because he lived in Dorchester when he was killed by the Mullins. He lived on Savin Hill Ave or in that neighborhood. But I don't know if that's where he was from. But he was probably, even more so than Bulger, he was probably like the most feared guy from the South Boston, Dorchester area, besides like Spike O'Toole's from Dorchester. He was a real killer, and he was respected and seemed to be well liked by most guys in the underworld. Like, I remember I read that when he got killed, everybody was like kind of talking about it. It got to like Steve Flemmi when he was on the run. He was out in Montreal on the lam, and word got to him, and he was kind of like bummed out because they all liked him. I remember also too, like he opened up an after hours club, and like all of these gangsters from all over Boston showed up on the first night, and Johnny Mortorano ended up getting into a beef with Tony Varenas. I made a video about that, and he killed him on the opening night, and so opening night was closing night for Billy O'Sullivan's crew. But Boston, South Boston was like basically a backwater. There were like the Colleens had what was it called, the Transit Cafe, and ended up becoming Triple O's when Bulger took over South Boston, and he renamed it Triple O's, but it was the same place, but it was called the Transit Cafe, and the Colleens ran their operations out of that, and it was mostly like loan sharking, horse and dog bet racing, maybe some numbers, but the rackets were kind of low key and Southie. It was basically, like I said, out of these barrooms, the culture and the social life was out of all these barrooms that were basically like on every street corner, and it was just low. It was really kind of like low ante stuff. You know, these guys weren't making a whole lot of money, and nobody really had a whole lot of money in Boston back then. But I mean, like I said, the North End and stuff like that, those guys made money because there was money in Boston, just not in certain neighborhoods. But like I said from the beginning throughout this video, Boston was a much poorer city. Like Boston, it's hard to visualize the way the city is now, how just the gentrification, how wealthy and just like yuppified, just tasteful it all is, you know. But Boston was such a different city. It was a tough, blue-collar, white. You got to understand, too, like, Boston was such a segregated city, not even between just white and black, but, like, all these other ethnic groups. Like, besides Dorchester was a pretty ethnically mixed neighborhood. Southie was almost all Irish. Charlestown was almost all Irish. Eastie was almost all Italian. North End was almost all Italian. Somerville was mixed. And then, like I'm saying, like South End, Roxbury, Potts Roxbury was where all the black kids lived. All the Jewish people lived in Mattapan and out into the western suburbs. Boston, up until the 2000s, was one of the most segregated northern cities, and I'm saying not just white and black, but with ethnic groups. You know, white ethnic groups. White ethnics like have their own like ghettos or slums. You know, it's kind of a wild thing to think of now. Just 20 years, 30 years later. In the 1990s, Boston was a completely different city than it is now. And I just can't stress this enough to people who watch it or people who are not from the same. People like, oh, Massachusetts, yeah. Like when they see me making like these mob videos or gangster videos about like Massachusetts and Boston. Oh yeah, I bet, buddy, yeah. It's like you have no idea like what Boston and Massachusetts used to be like from like the 1990s back through. And then the point of the video I'm trying to make now for today's videos from the 1960s, like pre-Irish gang war. The city of Boston was even completely different then, like pre-1960s, and then like the 70s, 80s, and 90s it changed so much because of urban renewal. They knocked down whole neighborhoods like the West End. I can't forget, real quick, I'm not going to talk too much about it because I'm going to make a video about it. The Roxbury, there was also a criminal group, a black criminal organization out of Roxbury that Johnny Morano was closely aligned with, and that was the Campbell brothers, and their main enforcer was Deke Chandler. So, real quickly, back in the late 1960s, or just during the 1960s, there's a lot of federal money going around for programs to help like the black communities for like job training, education, and it was notorious. There's all types of stuff about the Black Pea Stones in Chicago and LA and stuff like that. Black Panthers groups of all different types of organizations try to get their hands on this federal grant money and to use it for obviously for illicit reasons because the federal government really wasn't checking too hard to see who was getting their hands on this money. So in Boston, there was like a couple $1 million worth of grants up for grabs, and there was this guy named Guido Saint Laurent. I don't know if it was Saint Laurent or Saint Laurent, but he was like a blind ex-con and obviously some sort of hustler, and he formed, it was called New England Grassroots Organization, but the acronym, you spell it out, it's Negro, and it was on Blue Hill Ave, which is like the main thoroughfare through Black Boston, still is to this day, and he was aligned with this guy named Ronald Hicks, and he was like a big-time drug dealer and gangster in like the Roxbury area, like the Black Boston area, and this was like in the 60s when like all these northern big cities, the black neighborhoods are starting to see a bunch of heroin popping up, and the mafia is behind like the trafficking of it, but they only will allow it to be sold by black guys in like black neighborhoods. So basically, like, there's a beef between the Campbells and Ronald Hicks for control, like the drug proceeds, but also Ronald Hicks is aligning himself with this Guido Saint Laurent guy who's getting millions of dollars from the federal government through the Negro, the New England Grassroots Organization. So they're going to probably try to funnel this money into like the drug laundering, the drug trafficking game, you know, or some sort of illegal proceeds. And basically Alvin Campbell and his brother Arnold Campbell and Deke Chandler show up to their office on Blue Hill Ave and try to like rob them of the money or whatever, and an altercation breaks out, and I think 3 guys were ended up murdered, and Ronald Hicks survived the killing. He was there, he got shot, but he survived, and he was going to be a witness against the Campbell brothers and Deke Chandler, and Johnny Morano got to him. I guess their wife Bert came to Johnny Morano, he used to hang out all the time in Roxbury, and very close with like a lot of black friends, used to hang out with the black community, all like the Boston gangsters and mobsters and stuff. Knew that Johnny Morano was tight with like all these black guys, and their wife Bert came in and asked him for help, and Johnny Morano ended up finding Ronald Hicks and whacking him so he couldn't testify, and these guys got out of prison, and they were indebted to Johnny Morano, and then in turn they were basically got the whole drug game cornered in Roxbury and Boston and started bringing everybody. There was no independent drug dealers anymore. They had to like sell their dope or kick up money to them. So that's a big piece like of this thing too. It says they weren't involved in the gang war at all, but they were involved with Johnny Morano. It's part of like this time period and part of like a lot of urban lore and street stories that go along with all this stuff. And it's a chapter that maybe is left out because of the black population in Boston. Maybe they weren't involved in the gang war, and people didn't think maybe they had their own things going on. People talk about Roxbury, they talk about Wimpy Bennett's crew and stuff like that, but they don't talk about black gangsters, like the black crews and stuff, but there was a lot of shit going on also in the black communities with like the gangsters and violence and stuff like that too. And that's a great story. And like I said, I'm gonna make a video about that in the future, so I don't want to go too crazy about it. But I think I've kind of ranted and raved enough in this video. I hope I didn't go like too off track. I've been doing these quick uploads that I don't have to write like long scripts that are gonna take me days, so I can keep having videos coming faster. I hope you guys don't mind it. I hope I try to stay like on the main topic. The focus was to outline the different neighborhoods in Boston and the different crews that operate in these neighborhoods and like the different rackets that are involved, and try to give you like the makeup of the city, what it was like before the 1960s Boston gang war erupted, and like the landscape was different. The criminal groups, like some of these gangs, were completely wiped off the map. The whole outlook of Boston was so different, and it had been the same for basically decades before this. So you guys really seem to be interested in this time period, and it is. It's like the most interesting time period in Boston underworld besides like the 1990s. So I'll keep making content about it. Hit up the comments, you know, give me some requests, some ideas. I keep trying to make uploads like this every day. Like I said, I got the MS-13 script done. I'll probably do that. I'll record it and upload it in the next couple days, in between these daily like uploads, these quick videos here. And then like I said, I still need help, but nobody's contacted me yet. I need a photo of Jimmy Lamole. I'm not gonna do a video about the guy without a photo. I'm just not gonna do that. And so I want to give a quick shout out to all my guys here, because you guys are just you know, I can't thank all the people who watch, subscribe. It means so much to me. So let me just do a quick rundown here. Mike Gill, David Fishwick. Oh, and I got a new guy, a Greek brethren, George Bornakis. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name, brother. I appreciate all the comments, all the support. Thank you so much. It means a lot, really. I appreciate it. Chris Danju, Boston Red, aka Cali. Double O Banks. I've been digging, like, we've been having a lot of going back and forth with the comments lately, and you have a lot of good information, and a lot of good leads. Thank you very much. Ian Heslep, Italian Stallion, Mike Vesci like Joe Pesci, Tim Bell, Carolas Prima, Polly Dibbs, Oozing Machismo, aka Real Boston, Chucky O'Neill, Ryan Brown, aka Greased Lightning, Ryan Muldoon, Mr. S, haven't seen you in a while, hope you're alright, Count Smacula, Dave G, Horse Racing Tip, Ken Dolosandri. I'm sure I'm forgetting people and leaving people out. Don't be upset. Thank you so much, guys. Like, I appreciate all the support. Please hit the like button if you like this. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. Like I said, I hope you guys are liking these like quick uploads I'm doing here that I can do unscripted, just going from my big giant brain and my memory of all this stuff, and hope I'm not going off topic too much. I know some people will probably say in the comments that I rant, but whatever. Like I always say at the end, guys, remember to make good choices, take good care of yourselves, your loved ones, your fellow human beings. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. God bless.